Good evening. Hello. Yeah, it's finally 7:15. I'm Scott Foster from Asia Times, and this evening I have the privilege of introducing Professor Ulrike Schaede, who is a professor of Japanese business at the University of California, San Diego, and a proponent, an enthusiastic proponent of innovation and new developments in the Japanese corporate world that you may not be aware of. There have been some trends in the media and the financial markets that have continued for quite a long time, basically talking down Japan. Somehow it's the best place to live in Asia. It's the cleanest, safest, best managed country around, but they just have problems with their business. It's just not up to our standards. Anyway, whether you believe that or not, you are about to hear an argument on the side of Japanese business and innovation from a scholar who has done at least 9 years of research here in Japan with the Bank of Japan and other institutions, who is professor of business at UC San Diego, at the School of Global Policy and Strategy, and also the director of an organization called the Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology. She also runs a Japan Zoominar, if you want to keep up with this subject online. In my case, she's preaching to the converted, and we'll see if she can convert you over the next hour or so. So please give a warm welcome to Professor Ulrike Schaede.
I guess you can hear me like this? Okay, great. Thank you, Scott, for the nice introduction. In the Japanese fashion, of course, I have to tell you that I'm Ulrike Schaede from the University of California, San Diego, which you know have heard several times. So I'm very glad to be here, and I'm honored to have been invited. I want to thank Gary, my former student, for initiating this, and Moriwaki-san for all of her great services of getting me here in one piece with books to sign up. And also, I want to thank Taguchi-san, sitting over there, who is actually my editor for this book. So it takes a village. And thank you all for making this happen. So what I thought I would do today, I brought some PowerPoints. Can we turn these on? I see. So let me tell you while this is happening, the background of these books. So I felt in the 2010s that something was changing in Japan. Things were getting better. Things were getting different, and I decided to write a book about the business reinvention of Japan. And was then hell-bent to get that out by June 2020 in time for the Tokyo Olympics. I did publish the book in June 2020. The Olympics didn't happen, but okay. And I was fortunate to, that's the one. I was fortunate to win an award for this book, so it got translated into Saiko Zakaisha. And the idea here was that, play on Jim Bergelin's book, which honored me a lot, that the publisher wanted to do that. But it was really about, we need to take a new look at Japanese business. And then I was interviewed by a new startup called Pivot. And this was the people who started Newspeak, and they went over to a new thing called Pivot, a YouTube-based news organization. And that interview went viral. And so somehow I realized that I had hit the zeitgeist with something. I didn't know what it was, but 1.4 million people had watched this thing. So, and then a student came to me and says, well, you know, that book is too complicated. It's too big. It's too thick. Write a short one, you know, with the same message. And so I did. And that is this book titled New Japan Management, Let's Overcome the Negativity Bias. And that too, thanks to Taguchi-san, has become a good seller. And so what we're talking about today is the rewritten, repositioned English version of that book. So it's a little different. It's not a translation. It's a similar book, but rewritten for a non-Japanese audience. And the other thing that I don't know whether you're interested in this conversation or this part of the conversation, but this is an experiment, and I've decided to self-publish this with Amazon. And there are costs and benefits to everything. We'll talk about trade-offs later on here, but the benefit is I can set my own price, and I priced it at $5.99, which is 867 yen. It's less than a bowl of ramen. Right. If you want this version and you buy it from Amazon, it's $9.99. And then there's a hardcover thing for the libraries, I guess. I don't know. Don't worry about that. By the way, very interestingly, the royalties are the same for me across these formats. So Amazon takes all of the printing costs. There's something on Amazon as well. So the disadvantage is the print is not that pretty. You know, sort of. It's a little funky, big font or whatever. The charts may be too small, but in any event, if you read this book after this talk, maybe you're inspired and you find typos or any mistakes, if you could kindly let me know, because the advantage of self-publishing is that I can correct and then relaunch the thing. Right? So that's a big advantage. All right. So enough of this. Today, what I want to do is I want to introduce the following 4 main points. The first is I would like to convince you that the last 20 years were not stagnant, but a period of transformation. The 1990s were tough until 2005 or so, but ever since, if you look at the firm level, at what's going on at companies, there has been a huge shift. And I call this shift the Japan Inside shift. Namely a shift upstream into to the technology frontier, into upstream parts of this global value chains. Because it's inside, you don't see it as much. It's less visible, yet more powerful. I'll then talk a little bit about who these great companies are that I'm studying, and end on a note of why it would take 20 years for all of this to happen. I'm also thinking that we will speed up here shortly. All right, so when I come to Japan, and Scott mentioned this, right, there's all this bad news. Deflation, 20 years of no GDP growth, and the aging, shrinking society, and the regions, and the inefficiencies, and Japan can innovate, and so forth, and the zombie firms. And at a macro level, the data support most of these stories. I mean, we know that Japan is aging and shrinking, and GDP has not grown. But it's not the only story. If this were the only story, we could not explain Japan. There has to be another side to the story. So for instance, if this were the only story, we could not explain, I'm starting with GDP, I'm going to tell you at the end of it, forget GDP, but after 30 years of nothing, Japan is still the 4th largest economy in the world. How can that be? 30 years is a darn long time. That's a generation. Right? So we cannot explain this with the negative story, and the answer is it wasn't stagnant. Something happened during those 30 years. Maybe more surprising is a thing that comes out of Harvard, so it's got the imprimatur of the economists, the leading economists in the world, I guess. And the Harvard Growth Lab has created something what they call a productive knowledge ranking. And the productive knowledge ranking is about a country's export basket. So they take all the exports of a country. That's what they have. Those are the data they have. It's only exports, right? So manufactured goods, and they rank it by how complex these goods are and how ubiquitous. So, for instance, a T-shirt is an easy thing to make. Lots of countries can make it. Low score. A specialty chemical for semiconductor production, super complicated to make, and only a few countries can do it, very high score. All right? Okay, so here we go. And there's a puzzle. I don't give you the legend. What I'm telling you is that Switzerland and Germany I left out so that we can see at the top, but they're number 2 and number 3. And the legend goes like this. Japan has been number 1 for 30 years of alleged stagnation, where Japan supposedly was not innovative. And Japan were doing all of these no things, right? By the way, interestingly, South Korea is encroaching rapidly. Right? So that actually would be the one country, if we wanted to do country comparisons, I would recommend Japan to worry about Korea. The United States looks a little bit stagnant, which actually could be true, but note that this is exports, right? So the United States might get dinged on exporting rice and soybeans and that sort of thing, and it doesn't count data centers. And AWS and Alphabet will not show in this particular ranking because it's export goods. So the U.S. kind of is a little bit disadvantaged by this particular chart. All right. So how do we explain this? What's the story? And the story, I think, is that there are some very, very good companies in Japan, and then a whole bunch of not so great companies. And so in a way, the Japanese economy is some sort of expression of the 80-20 principle, where 20% of what we do in a given day explains 80% of our output, or in industries like hotels or keitai or airplanes, 20% of customers explain 80% of revenue, right? And I think that in Japan, we're currently at a situation where 20% of companies explain 80% of the economic activity. And that there's, insofar as there's a bias among, we're at the FCCJ here, among media and reporting, is that they report more on the bad companies than the good companies, partially because that makes better headlines, right, scoops and so forth, and partially maybe a selection bias, that we've heard the story about the bad Japan for so long that even if we hear a good story, we don't quite believe it. The hope then is that if we study the front runners, let's stop studying the losers. Let's study the front runners, and then if we study the front runners, maybe we can move to more of a 40-60 or 60-40 situation. Right? So that's sort of the hope message in the Japanese version of the book. Okay. So there are really 2 narratives here of Japan. The narrative that we all know is what's now increasingly called in Japan the Nihon Dame Dameron. It's all so bad. It's so bad. After the bubble, Japan collapsed. 3 decades of nothing, the ice age, the deflation, the employment, all of this is bad. And Japan has lost it. That's the story we know. And if you hear a story often enough, it eventually becomes true. It becomes a thing that you know, right? But so how about the alternative story, the Maimukiron, or the slow is not stagnant story? And that's, by the way, what I'm going to end on, right? Slow is slow, but slow is not stagnant. So the bubble economy was a crucial inflection point. It marked the arrival of Japan, no longer as a follower and copier of US technologies, but at the technology frontier. Then the bubble happened, which was, unfortunate. It was a party. Maybe Japan partied a little bit too long. And as Japan was licking its wounds, the banking crisis, many companies overlooked the rise of South Korea, Taiwan, and China that were catching up with Japan. However, more importantly, having arrived at the technology frontier meant that Japanese companies had to find a new business model. That the Showa business model of copying or adopting or licensing or whatever, using made in the West technologies so in the West I mean Europe and the United States mostly at the time, and then turning them into nifty consumer end products that could then be sort of sold around the world, those days were over. That the Japanese companies had to get their heads around the fact that they needed to develop their own technologies. So let me, this is actually the core chart. So if you allow me, I will actually go and show you this. Maybe I'll show this here, and I don't want to disadvantage the people sitting over there. So the other slide, I'll come over there. So this is the core slide of the whole story. I don't know whether you can see it from there, but so what we have here is a typical value chain for a manufactured product, right? So it starts with a design, and then there are some input materials and input parts, and then we get into the assembly, and then the logistics, and that's very normal. Over this, I'm overlaying what in Asia a lot of people know, but in the United States, by the way, very few people are aware of, which is the, oh, I forgot my clicker, sorry, which is the smile curve of profits. The smile curve of profits, the story goes that the CEO of Acer, the Taiwanese computer company, drew it on a napkin in an izakaya in roughly 1995. And what he was trying to show here is, I'm sorry, it's cut off here. Some measure of performance, operating margin or something, and the stage of production, right? And basically, Acer's insight was that they were making basic electronics, and that the rise of China had wiped out all profit possibility at this part of the production. And now there is not a single sort of METI government report or anything that does not have the smile curve in it. It so captured the China, the China rise and the Asia reality of manufacturing. Right? So basically, we all know Japan's old bailiwick, the Toyota production system, right? And lean production and producing consumer end products at the highest level of yield and quality. And the rise of China wiped that out. Okay, so simple strategy 101, what do you do? Well, there are two things. One, you could raise the level of what you do, right? So Panasonic just issued a Shinhatsubai $900 hairdryer that apparently makes your hair moist while it's drying it. I'm not an expert. But the story is true. The Dyson, Dyson did the same thing with the vacuum cleaner. So you could move the level up, right? But actually much simpler, or in the case of Japan, more common, is you avoid this assembly thing and you move upstream into the advanced inputs and materials, where not only is the profit higher, but because there's a dependency, you're also a price setter, right? And you could also move into logistics, downstream, which also is something like shipping, storage, that sort of thing, tuck you in, there where you can make a lot of money. What's happened is that the Japanese companies that were in this spot realized if we start innovating, especially in chemicals, let's get out of bulk chemicals into advanced chemicals for semiconductor production, or let's get out of normal steel and make super high advanced metals that we need for something, right? Okay, I've called this a Japan Inside phenomenon, right? Because remember Intel, when there was a little sticker, actually there's a sticker on this thing, Intel Inside, this computer says. And there's no Japan Inside sticker. If there were a Japan Inside sticker, not a day would go by where you wouldn't realize that you use at least 10 products with a Japan Inside sticker every time you look at your phone. There's a 0.5 probability that the camera, the glass substrate, or that sort of thing, the outside is from Japan, but inside the connectors, the AC-DC converter, there's a 0.9 probability that that's made in Japan. Right? Your car would not drive without Japan. There are parts in there. I'm willing to bet money, no matter whether it's a BMW or a Cadillac or whatever, certainly, of course, a Toyota, but it doesn't matter what you drive. Okay, so by the way, with the possible exception of rare earth, Japan is actually the only country in the world that could make a semiconductor. by itself if we had complete decoupling. But that's a different story. I'll go there later. Okay, so I came to this because in 2010, the Asia Development Bank Institute here in town actually took apart the first iPhone. And they wanted to know who creates the value added for the iPhone. And they found that a third of the value added of the iPhone at the time was contributed by Japanese companies, and then 17% by Germany. That's one company that make the liquid crystals that are shooting around that screen. And China, with all its assembly, contributed less than 4% of that thing. Right? So if we look under the cover, we see a lot of Japan. So my question was, well, okay, so who's benefiting from this? Who's making the money here? And so I got to study these companies, and we're going to talk a little bit of sumo here in a moment. But what I realized, what these companies were doing, the ones that were feeding into the iPhone and moving up in the metals and the bulk chemicals, rather, advanced chemicals, they faced the following strategic challenge. The entire Showa business model was about being big. The bigger, the better. Large companies had access to talent, right? The university students all wanted to work for large companies. They had access to trade quotas by METI during the US-Japan trade quarrels and whatnot. They had access to all kinds of, they had the assets. So they were really, really big. And what happened next over the 20 years of transformation really is well described by sumo. I don't know, I'm looking around in the room. I don't know how many of you remember Konishiki and Akebono. They were bubble era, so late 80s, early 90s sumo, and they were massive. They actually created this idea that sumo was governed by massive men, right? So Konishiki was 184 centimeters and 290 kilograms. Akebono was taller, a little lighter. They were massive. Akebono passed away earlier this year, and the New York Times had an article where they cited him as saying, "We did it through brute strength. Brute strength. We just pushed these little guys out of the ring," basically, is what he was saying, right? Okay, my favorite sumo at the time, I don't know about you guys, but my favorite sumo at the time was Mai no Umi. And Mai no Umi was actually a little shorter than I am and weighed nary 100 kilos. And yet he beat those two guys repeatedly, right? And he did by having certain techniques that he developed. He actually developed these techniques. So the techniques by the sumo kyokai are called waza. And Mai no Umi came to be known as waza no depato. And I think, so for me, what's happening in Japanese business right now is a spit image of this waza no depato strategy. So, so the store of superior techniques, right? So I call this the Mai no Umi strategy. And the Mai no Umi strategy is for these large Japanese companies that used to be these Showa, the kings of the Showa era, to go on a diet, although not necessarily to get smaller. The big is good. Being large as a company is always great, right? You have lots of assets, you have great people, you have installations, you have resources. Big is not bad, but it has to be more strategic. But the diet is also important, or the little is a little bit important in the sense that Mai no Umi, when I met him, and I asked him, well, why did you develop so many waza? Start a conversation, and he said, "Chokumen wa muri dakara." Can't take them on head on. And the thing is, China will always be bigger than Japan. Everybody knows that. Size alone cannot win, right? Size is good, but size alone won't win. So Japanese companies, to compete in certainly in the Northeast Asian supply chain sort of setting, have to be smarter. And in order to be smarter, they have to become a different athlete. Right? They have to develop their own waza, they have to compete through technology, and they have to move upstream into these Japan inside things. By the way, this smile curve business model, let me just go back. Wrong way, sorry. One more thing, and this is actually the business model of Apple, if you think about it, right? So they just design their stuff in Cupertino and they sell it to us in their ritzy, glitzy retail stores, and they make a ton of money on both ends, and they outsource everything that's at the bottom, right? Uniqlo is doing the same thing. The exact same thing, right? So this is actually a winning strategy in that regard. Okay, so nice story. I'm talking about sumo and so forth. How do we know that this is happening? Now let me show you some data. And now I'm going to come over there for equality and diversity purposes. So this looks a little bit like a crazy chart, but fear not. I will explain it. So this is a survey by METI and NEDO. NEDO is an agency affiliated with METI, the New Energy Development Organization, something like that. And so they did this study. METI has been doing the study of this for a while now. What we see here is what they're graphing is the global market size from $1 billion all the way to whatever, 10 trillion, depending on your exchange rate. And the combined market share of Japanese companies. So orange is automobiles. And then the little orange ones are hybrids. And so we know that the automobile industry is a huge industry, and Japanese companies combine to about a third of that industry. They have about a 30% global market share, which is roughly here if you buy that. And then yellow is auto parts, blue is electronics, and teal is electronic parts, okay? So more than these big bubbles, I forgot my thing again, but now I've explained this. More than these big bubbles, what I'm really interested in is actually this Milky Way at the lower right-hand corner. Right? And those are smaller markets where Japanese companies combine to anywhere between 80 and 100% of global market share. And you could, right, and that's a power. That creates dependencies, that allows pricing power, that's important. Now, these are only 5 industries. Right, so these are the 5 industries that, I'll switch back to this microphone. These are the 5 industries that they chose to study. So it's automobiles, electronics, and in pink is biotech. And then silver is others, like batteries, something, so, right? Okay, so let me blow this up a little bit, give you the data here. So these are these bubbles, and so METI, or the NEDO, at its last iteration, studied 1,024 global products that they handpicked. This is not an academic study. We're not talking about the universe of Japan, right? We're talking 5 industries. And in these 5 industries, in 1,024 global products, Japanese companies combined to over 50% of market share in 409. And the average market size was $2.5 billion, depending again on the exchange rate, give or take, 2 billion, 4 billion, doesn't matter. It adds up, right? It adds up. In the aggregate, this is a very powerful position. So if we had more industries, it would be impossible to read, but we could do chemicals in here, right? We could probably, all of you can think of an industry where you know some Japanese companies that are leading competitors that we could graph here. Okay, so this is sort of the Mai no Umi strategy in pictures. And now you might think, well, isn't this normal? Doesn't every country have this? And the answer is no. So this is South Korea. It's mostly cars. Mostly semiconductors, and some cars. Hyundai is making really great cars now, right? And so Taiwan, only semiconductors. China, of course, has bubbles, but not that much at the 80% plus range, although China is, of course, the biggest problem here because that's exactly what they want. The good news on the China-Japan trade relations is that these markets are fairly small. And so they don't fit in quite into the industrial policy plan of China 2025, which is large impact, high employment industries, and not these tiny little, sort of highly advanced photoresists or something. By the way, just to preempt your first question, which is always the question I get, when will China catch up with these bubbles? And the answer to that is that question presupposes that the Japanese companies are sitting still, which they aren't. right? And so they're making always better photoresists and always better other things. But yes, so there's competition. This is not static, it's very dynamic. The EU, just to finish this, has a big pink bubble. That's the BioNTech vaccination after COVID, right? And you know, a number of, you know, auto parts and so forth. Okay. The United States has semiconductors and biotech, as expected, in these 5 industries. All right, one more slide and then we're moving on. So this last bubble thing is a comparison. On the left is 2006 and on the right is 2016. And so what I want to visualize here just simply is that this is a recent phenomenon. Like there are many, many more bubbles in 2016 than there were in 2006 at the high end, right? So that's this Japan inside move. Okay, so a couple of more things. One is a sort of a little strategy thing. So the power of this comes in one of 2 ways. One is that one company actually occupies several of these bubbles, right? So JSR makes photoresist, but also polarizer film and brightness film and, you know, some other stuff. Nitto, which is Japan's 3M, makes a number of advanced chemicals. Fanuc, of course, numerical controls and robotics and factory automation and so forth. And the other play is several Japanese companies are in one bubble. So JSR is not the only Japanese company that makes photoresist. There's also TOK. You know, and then so we can look at that more sort of combined market shares, like there are certain parts of factory automation and semiconductor production and production equipment where Japanese companies combine to 100% of the global market. And the final thing on my bubbles, okay, no slide there, is that this is not a hidden champion story, you know, some guy in otaku with making a particular, like the movies have it, right, or the global niche champions or whatever they're called. No. We're talking listed companies. These are all listed companies. I've only studied listed companies because that's where the data are, right? And so, I'm talking Hitachi. Getting out of, Hitachi is actually a great example of this, selling off Hitachi Kasei and the Kinzoku and the construction equipment and the medical and so forth, not because those weren't profitable, but because that no longer fits the strategy of becoming a global smart city technology leader. Will they succeed? We don't know. But I actually respect that they have the chutzpah to do this. I mean, this is a real transformation. There are other. I could go on. You know, I could talk about Asahi Glass and how they're getting out of window glass and into advanced, you know, auto glass and so forth. So there are lots and lots of examples. Fujifilm is now. You may remember Fuji Photofilm, but not only have they changed their name, they are now predominantly a medical device and CDMO company, right? So at the firm level, the transformations that we can observe are they're not only aplenty, they're also, you know, really, really drastic. Okay, so I started you out with the iPhone, and somebody at Nikkei took apart the 2019 Huawei, top-of-the-line Huawei phone, and they found the exact same thing, namely that Japan contributed a large portion of this phone. They couldn't quite count filters, oscillators, vibrators, and contacts, which all happen to be things that Japanese companies dominate. Right? So this continues. Okay, so Scott, how am I doing on time? If you can, well, I know, but I want to pace myself.
Leave question time.
Yeah, no, I do want to leave question time. Okay, so here's a slide that I thought would come earlier. So here's a list of companies that are doing this. I don't know whether you've heard of Resonac, which is the result of the merger between Hitachi Chemical and Showa Denko, and they're cooking some very interesting things there. And Kians, of course. So it's not a hidden champion story. It's out. If you know what you're looking for, it's there to see. This is not a secret. Okay, so one more thing on the power. these are 2018 data, and so there may be some changes now, but basically what I want to show you here is the trade dependencies in Northeast Asia. And so China and Hong Kong and Japan, depending on the exchange rate again, but it's roughly equal. In this particular year, it was 180 billion going each way. Right, so that there's no trade deficit or anything. Interestingly, Taiwan and South Korea have a trade deficit with Japan because they're buying the production equipment and some of these chemicals that they then turn into input parts. And then China has a trade deficit with South Korea and Taiwan because they're buying these parts that they then put together to make an iPhone or an iPad or whatever. All of this is probably soon to be disrupted, but there's a very interesting discussion to be had whether or not this might be actually quite stabilizing in Northeast Asia, because these players benefit from this current situation very much. Okay, so let me move on and talk a little bit about who these frontrunners are. So this actually goes back to the early 2000s when I started this research, and this is just simply a chart of how everything is going south, right? So the macroeconomists that have a bad story about Japan have it right. This is operating margin and ROE of listed companies, and it's a down, down, down. So in 2010, I was curious who the good companies were, right? Because there had to be some good companies. So I went out and I gathered the data. And so this is a chart of the average operating margin and its standard deviation of Japanese listed companies in fiscal years 2000 to 2009. And so you stir the Nikkei needs data, and this is what you get. And so obviously low standard deviation means that they were steadily profitable over this entire period, not these like one-hit wonder stories. And not surprisingly, Kians and Fanak at the top, and then Sankhya was actually a pachinko maker, and these were bad days, right? So they had a good time. But I was more interested in, I actually did go and talk to them. That was very interesting. I was more interested in, so the red ones are the ones I interviewed. And so I looked for common threads. What did these companies have in common that they were so profitable? And none of the accounting data would yield anything. They were large, they were small, they're foreign ownership or not, or different industries. So there was just a mixed bag. So I went and interviewed them, and I learned that they all shared what I have since called the 7P. 7 characteristics that perhaps are true for good firms everywhere, I don't know, but let me just briefly walk you through it. So they all were very profit-oriented. They were profitable, of course. I mean, I ranked them by profit, so duh. But it wasn't an accident that they were profitable. They had a plan. There was one CEO told me, if the gross margin is not 30%, we don't do it, which is a very rare thing, or at least at the time, was a very rare thing for a Japanese CEO to say. They had a clear plan, very compelling strategy, a vision. Where is this thing going? You know, why are we going there? How are we going to get there? The P for paranoia I bought from the late Andy Grove. Only the paranoid survive. Right. So there's a sense of urgency. They were constantly going, oh, where is the competition? What do we have to do? How can we go more upstream or less upstream or whatever? P, parsimony is a funky English word, of course, for being frugal. But what I needed a P word, but what I wanted to say was that they're very efficient, even in their language. So scheduling the appointment was great. They're very polite, but not this like overly keigo kind of thing. Very limited to horenso, hokaku renaku, sodan. They were much more efficient in many ways. Their PR stands for transparency. I could actually sense this from their websites. So for instance, one of the, this is 2010, 2011 when I did this, and one of the companies that popped up on the list was Olympus. It was just before the scandal. And the website, there was no information on the website. It was, the website was suspicious. And I got really good at this because I looked at company after company after company. I should have become a whistleblower based on the information on the website. So these companies that were great were very transparent, most of them. People stands for leadership, and the CEOs were just very compelling and impressive. And pride is another funky P word, because pride in Japanese, of course, not such a great word. But what I mean here is they were all, the employees were iki. They were totally motivated. They were very happy to work at these companies in the middle of these bad days, right? So I think to this day, the companies that I'm studying have these 7P, which is actually quite interesting, sort of a okay, so and so what we learned from that is basically this old notion that Japanese companies are all alike, and that there's strategic convergence, and that they all do the same thing. That's over. Forget it. These companies are doing something very different. There's a differentiation strategy. Okay, so so now we come to the final question. So, okay, so why did this have to take 20 years? And here the story gets deeper into this question of what is actually GDP and what is stagnant and so forth and so on. And so I want to make 3 points. So first is that slow is partially related to this early chart that I showed you about the complexity of products. I mean, these companies are not making T-shirts. These are huge installations. I mean, Asahi Glass has billions of dollars in glass and chemical assets. They can't just shut those down, right? Or give them away, or say, oh, we do something else tomorrow. I mean, that just takes time, right? So it takes time to change a deep tech company. But perhaps more importantly, I think slow is a choice. It's a trade-off. All of these things are trade-offs, right? And so in my view, it's not so much incompetence, although, I mean, there are incompetent leaders everywhere, right? But there's no reason to believe that the average Japanese CEO is less competent than the average American CEO, right? So if they're slower, there must be a reason. And one reason is that we're incentivized by the system. Piecemeal deregulation, laws, rules, regulation, but also society. Right? So if you think back to the early days of the early 2000s, the public outcry was not that companies were slow in transforming. The public outcry was that they were replacing seishain with non-regular workers. How could they? Right? And that led me to come to this other point, which is that slow is the price that Japan is paying to maintain social stability in a period of transformation. That it reflects the preferences of this country, of these countries' leaders, whether it's politicians, they want to be reelected, right? Whether it's parents, whether it's employees, if it's employers. There's a sort of a tacit agreement that we don't want to go so fast that we cannot maintain employment and we cannot maintain social stability. And so slow is not stagnant. It's just different from the United States. And so this is where I get to my pet peeve with the American economists. I mean, the story of the Nihon Damedameron, the Japan that lost it, is a story by US economists or people that are trained in economics in the United States, for whom the GDP growth is the one thing they can measure, is the one thing that counts. And their success of their definition of a successful economy is one where GDP growth is high. And that makes sense, but in the United States, presidents win or lose elections based on GDP growth. That does not really make sense for Japan. Right? Yes, of course, Japanese people would like GDP growth and rankings and so forth. Yeah, there's a lot of, but it's not as important as maybe, obviously, not as important as social stability. So I have a whole long thing on culture, but let me just, if you're interested in some sort of this culture story, I can get you there. But I want to actually end on this debate. So the ketsuron of the whole thing is actually kind of segs me into my next book. But when I wrote this book, we asked Toyama-san, I don't know whether you know him, Toyama Kazuhiko-san, whether he would write the OB at the scarf, this red thing that comes off. And he got back to us and he said, this book is a 21st century version of Japan as number one. And so my heart took a little bit of a beat. Oh boy! I mean, Ezra Vogel, okay, all right. So what did Toyama-san mean? And clearly, this is not about Japan being number one in GDP ranking or economic, whatever. That's not in the cards, right? And so he led me to think about this more. And so I don't know what he meant, but I think he just meant that it was a book that described that Japan was different and it was doing it at its own pace, and that difference could be an advantage, right? And I think that was the first takeaway. But I also think that in the 21st century, maybe we don't care that much about GDP growth. I mean, we have too many people, too many things, too much waste, too much anyway. So, so the new thing could be a new balance, a balance between economic growth and social stability, right? A new set of trade-offs that allow us to balance, as an interview, as a CEO I interviewed today said, ecology and economy, right? So, the economic production and sustainability. A balance between progress, corporate progress, and human well-being, right? And I can tell you one thing: the United States is not going to find that balance for us. And of course, I mean, there's so much that we could in the Q&A we can talk about. So there's so many things that Japan is trying to be like Silicon Valley, or Japan is trying to do this and then the other thing, and I just don't think that those things are for Japan. And so I don't know whether this is going to happen, but if Japan can find this new balance, or maybe take us on a way and a path towards this new balance, it could actually guide other countries to a better system than we currently have, right? And it's harder to measure, how do you measure balance? It's not year-on-year change. Economists wouldn't know what to do if they saw it, right? And so, that's a whole new think piece. But in any event, so here's me and my Numi. He really does not look like a sumo. He's a great strategist, though. So thank you all. Let's open that up for Q&A.
All right. I have about 50 questions, but I'll let you ask yours first. Raise your hand if you have a question, and then when you're identified, please come to one of the mics and introduce yourself before you ask your question. Who would like to start?
Well, you have the mic. Oh, there's one.
There you go. Yes, sir.
Thank you for this. This is wonderful. Kevin Newman, I work with Insight Consulting. One of the things that you mentioned about the survey that was done originally about the METI survey is it didn't look at the tech sector from a data standpoint, from a digital standpoint, whether it be data centers or looking at new platforms, just all the companies where a lot of economic growth has actually come from that in the U.S. and particularly in Europe or other places where they found that. Mm-hmm. I haven't actually seen anything that really shows the impact of that in Japan or the lack of it, because it is a hard thing, the hard manufacturing here. So how do you see that as a part of the discussion going forward with Japan?
Yeah, I think there are people in this room who know more about data centers and that sort of thing. I've had a very interesting conversation with Koshiba-san, who used to be the CEO of JSR, and I've known him for many years. And he's now, somehow involved with the, building up Rapidus, which is Japan's bet on the next generation semiconductors. And he wrote a book called 2040半導体の未来 or something like that. So 2040 semiconductor future, and it has some very interesting charts. So just as a timeout little footnote, I think, Kevin, you might be very interested to hear. We all know that Japan is a huge importer of energy. Big akaji, right? Big trade deficit in energy. Japan's trade deficit in energy is surpassed by only one thing, and that is Japan's trade deficit in data center services. So Japan now spends more money, gives more money to AWS and Alphabet and Microsoft than it spends on oil, coal, and LNG combined, right? So that's to your point. So I asked Koshiba-san, and he said two very interesting things. The first is there are different types of, I don't know whether we wanted to go to wars, but now I did it. So he said there's a military war, there's an economic war, and there's a technology war. And let's just hope that the first doesn't happen and the second we can somehow, But the technology war, he says, is already there. And the reason that we're already in a 20-year technology war is that all these leading countries are putting 50 billion, 100 billion, whatever dollars into semiconductor production, and that stuff has to be amortized. And it'll take 20 years to amortize that. So the decoupling on the semiconductors is already happening, right? So then out of this comes now to your question, Kevin. So this is an industry leader in Japan, right? And he has thought this through, and he's shaping policies and so forth, I guess. And he said that no country can be fully self-sufficient in all of this, and it's not necessary if he can somehow find synergies, right? So the United States actually needs Japan for a number of things related to semiconductor production and so forth. And Japan needs these data centers, and it makes very little sense for Japan to build them now. That would be another technology war kind of thing going on, right? And so the hope is that that can be avoided, and that if you have friends, you don't need to make this all by yourself, right? And so he starts out the story with the technology one that says, but if you have friends, you don't need to have all of this, right? And I think that's a very long way of saying, I don't know what the answer is to that question. But let's hope that, I think the United States and Japan are friends, and the Security Alliance will make sure that stays. So I think there's no other way, right? And so then, would it really make sense in economic and other terms for Japan to go solo on data centers, or would it make much more sense, right, to let it be as it is, and then have Japan contribute to the use cases and the development of what we can do with these data centers and that sort of thing, right? But I don't know whether that's going to bite Japan at some point, or other countries for that matter. I mean, it's not just Japan, right? I mean, the entire world is dependent on those four guys, or the Magnificent Seven, or Six, or whatever that is. So I don't think it makes sense for Japan to go upstream on that part. But what, of course, Japanese companies are looking into is, okay, so what do you need to run those data centers? You need semiconductors. What else do you need? Right? And so is there some upstream play in the hardware of this, or in the infrastructure of this, that we can move into and create one of those bubbles?
Next.
I've exhausted the crowd.
Fill the vacuum here.
They're intimidated.
John Chesson with the Baird Brewing Company. I learned about tonight's event from Gary Bremerman, good old friend, and who spends his days helping companies in the human capital space. So taking one plank of the dame-dame-ron, people, aging society, as Japan's cluster of world-beating companies try to keep it going. Obviously, there are going to be human capital challenges. How, given this context of an aging society, a falling population, does Japanese businesses, these CEOs you're talking to, how do they describe their, strategies for grappling with this and continuing to be dynamic?
Yeah. So first little fact, which is actually very interesting, is that in spite of the aging and shrinking society, Japanese workforce has actually grown over the last decade. because the women are entering. And then last week's news, right? So for the first time in record keeping, more women in Sogushoku career positions than in Pato positions. But that said, there is a labor shortage. Plus, we also know for sure there will be a worse of a labor shortage because there's absolutely nothing we can do about it. So we can read the future of that, like, beautifully. And so by 2050 or so, the Japanese workforce will have shrunk by something like 20%. Right? So immigration, a big issue. I would like to guide you to, or to invite you to look at actually the data. There's a lot of dama on Japan and immigration, and Japan needs more immigration and so forth. Currently, 3% of the Japanese workforce are foreigners. That's actually quite normal. That's not even low anymore. So we need to revisit that thing. And the other thing is that I think I could go on a whole thing of why immigration is phased in the way it is, but that's a longer lecture. But one more thing on to your question. I think that Japan might actually face what I've called a lucky moment, in the sense that this aging. So Japan, of course, the front runner in the aging, shrinking workforce situation, and for Japan, therefore, this onset of the labor shortage is happening at the same time as the digital transformation, which makes the digital transformation a friend, right? I mean, if you look at just book covers on DX, or whatever the Americans call this now, big data, or this AI, the book covers in the United States are all kawaii. It's horrible. It's Star Wars. It's there. Somebody is coming and eating our jobs and eating us and the UFOs and whatnot. It's horrible. You look at books, you go to a Japanese bookstore and you look at books on DX, it's happy pepper eyes. It's wonderful, right? Oh, we can do something with this. It might help us. And then in walks Toyota and says, we will be a mobility as a service company in 10 years from now, which means that all cars will be completely standardized and commoditized because nobody will own a car anymore. We will just use it for transportation. And totally commoditized cars, a robot can make. Problem solved. The car worker of the future in Toyota's vision is somebody who sells you services while you're being transported from A to B. Right? And so in general, this whole digital transformation thing, when the internet first came, we were deploring, the email, right, the arrival of email. How many jobs would that destroy? The secretary and the assistant and so forth, and the internet would, destroy all of this. We didn't know that the internet also would create new jobs, like website designers. Right? 20 years ago, we had no idea what that was. There was no such thing. Right? And so I think we're in a similar situation where we actually don't know what the future jobs are and what it would take. And so how Japan will address that is another thing where Japan could actually show us what the future might look like, or what mistakes to avoid. Right? So a lot of these frontier things, mistakes will happen. Bets will be taken the wrong way, and as a front runner, Japan will make some of these mistakes, and we should just be careful that we don't just poo-poo that and say, "See, they've lost it." And we're experimenting at that frontier as well.
Next. Oh, come on. Don't be intimidated. It's difficult, but not
Well, you said you had 50. Give me one.
Okay. All right. But you stole one of my old ideas, which is that only Japan has the full range of materials and equipment to manufacture a semiconductor. Americans cannot make semiconductors without Japanese equipment and materials, but Japan can make them. So could you comment on what that means in terms of how we understand the semiconductor industry, which, if you read the newspapers, is mainly TSMC and Intel and Samsung, and that's all. The, but it's not all.
Yeah, so the answer is Japan Inside, right? So
Yeah.
that is a sort of the Japan Inside story. And it is true. I mean, it's absolutely true. In 1999, 2000, NEC was the largest semiconductor company in the world, followed by, I forget, I mean, all of them, right? The Fujitsu, Hitachi, NEC. And then in the banking crisis, I mean, the banking crisis was a real thing, right? And so they, whether that was a means of survival or because Samsung had, successfully copied this, or some of the technology had been shared with TSMC, whatever your favorite story is, or maybe all of these happened together, the Japanese the semiconductor leaders spun out or spun off their semiconductor operations and merged them. And there's still, Renesas still exists, so it's not, and so there is some sort of residual tacit knowledge on how to do this stuff. And these people are still around, right? Was it a mistake? I don't know. Maybe mistakes happen. But the reality is, because of this Japan Inside shift upstream into production equipment, and then there's advanced test. Nobody can test like advanced test, right? So there's a lot of this equipment around, and then of course the materials and the photoresists, and all the way up to the wafers and Shin-Etsu chemical and so forth. So all of this exists, and now with TSMC in Kumamoto, this is sort of a juku. Let's get upgraded on the latest technologies, and Rapidos in Hokkaido will be sort of, okay, let's push the frontier. And so, maybe it was a mistake in the 2000s to get out of this, maybe it wasn't, but it can be rebuilt, and I think there's an active way of rebuilding this. And I don't see that in the United States. I mean, the Arizona TSMC plant is still in the design phase, and the Kumamoto one is almost up and running, if I'm not mistaken.
Exactly.
Right? And why is that? And Intel, well, let's not talk about Intel. That's a whole different story. So there is this reality, and we don't know that. So there's also another. Some of you are more expert in this than I am, but my understanding is also it's incredibly difficult to parse this out, right? To parse out these data. So when we look at the data, we don't see this for two reasons. One, they can't actually go all the way in. It's too complicated to identify the value added of that, of that piece of photoresist or something. And the second, more important, is that they only have, the people who study this only have trade data. But JSR, for instance, makes photoresist in Belgium and right next to Samsung in Korea and here. And in Santa Clara. And so they're global, and the economists have no way to assess this because those data don't exist. We don't know the impact of Japan's global production network. I mean, Rick has been telling me that I need to study this for years on end now. And I do want to study it, right? And so Japan's global production network is quite the thing. I've looked at the data of sales of Japan's companies abroad. They've been growing at an 8% CAGR for the last decade. Right? So the growth of Japan is actually happening outside of Japan. Now that also is bad. I mean, not all of this is repatriated, so the Japanese people don't necessarily get all of that. But that's a separate story from the damedameron of Japanese industry. Right? And so we don't know. Right? People don't know. The data don't show that Japanese companies are making these things because they're making them, around the world, and it's difficult to measure. And so you read a semiconductor report somewhere, and it says, oh, Japan has a 10% market share in this, or kind of 5% global market share in that, but it doesn't actually measure the far end. Rick, if you want to disagree with that, then by all means do.
You and I are totally aligned. The secret of TSMC, and I've been looking at TSMC since the ground was broken. The secret of TSMC is they know how to work and manage the Japanese supply chain. And whether it's Asahi Glass with masks or Hoya or JSR, so the inside of an ASML stepper, which is assembled in Holland, if you look inside, everything is Japanese, except for one thing. The laser.
Called Siena thing.
Yeah, the laser is either Cymer or it's Komatsu. And Cymer started in San Diego, so I'll give you that. I have a question that leaves me scratching my head. So you and I are totally aligned on I think one reason that Japanese companies can take it slowly is because Japan is stable. So one, that keeps Japan stable, but also Japan is a stable environment to take a very long term. What's more difficult to understand was, like, one of the biggest things we've seen is the dismantling of cross-shareholding in Japan. Cross-shareholding was basically a post-war phenomenon, but it worked very, very well for the fast growth period, and now it's being dismantled. And I could remember people talking in the Ministry of Finance in METI about we have to dismantle cross-shareholding in the 1990s. But bureaucrats rotate every 3 years. Somehow, they've maintained that concept that step by step by step, we have to dismantle cross-shareholding. And the dismantling of cross-shareholding is a very big part of the renaissance of what we're seeing in Japan. Japan can take those long things, how the decisions are made, how they're sustained, whereas the United States takes a 90-degree turn every 4 years at least, or sometimes in the midterm election they take a 45-degree turn. We're constantly taking turns. Japan has sustained this even through changes in party. It's a phenomenon that I can see, but I really can't totally understand. Maybe you have a way to think about that, Ulrike.
Well, well, first of all, it means a lot to me that we're aligned and that the eminent Japan semiconductor Tatsujin has no bones to pick with what I just said. So thank you. I think it suits Japan. Right? It's like, just like quiet. Suits the preferences. I mean, it's just so I have this whole slide deck that I didn't show, but there's actually a new theory in international business called tight loose theory, and it's about culture. Actually, if that's of interest, I see people pull out their things. So. This is was developed by Michelle Gelfand, who is a cultural anthropologist who's now at Stanford Business School. And so she's developed this thing called tight-loose theory. And what they did there is they start with the idea that behavior, the culture is the norms of behavior, and that if we just observe what people do, right, so their actual behavior, that's just the tip of the iceberg. So why do countries differ in this sort of thing, right, in these behaviors? And they have two dimensions to that. One is the consensus of what the right behavior is, and the intensity with which people share that is the right behavior, right? And so they actually did a study of 33 countries. They asked 7,000 people things like, is it okay to eat in an elevator? Or is it to sing while you're walking down the street? Or can you laugh out loud in class? Or can you wear headphones to a restaurant? Right? Can you kiss at a funeral or flirt at a funeral or something like that? And then they had a Likert scale, right? So the respondents could say absolutely okay, or maybe okay, or I don't know, or maybe not okay, or absolutely not okay. So they could measure two things, right? One was the consensus. Absolutely. Did everybody say it's okay or not okay? And then the intensity. Did they say absolutely, or did they say maybe? Right? And so there's a ranking, and this is the ranking. I selected some countries here, and what we see is that Japan is at the top, tight. It's called tight, right? So high consensus, high intensity about feeling what is the right behavior, and the United States pretty much is the bottom. Interesting to my friends from Europe that Germany came in tighter in the old East 20 years after unification than the former West, and then there. So why? I mean, I could give a whole 1 hour thing on this, right? So one reason why this might be persistent over time is that we're talking about behavioral norms, right? We're all following rules on dividing garbage, properly, and moedigumi is on Mondays, and and if you walk out with your plastic balls, oh my God, you go back in, you take your shoes back off to bring it back home. So we all follow that. Why? Because we all understand and we agree that Tokyo would be a royal mess if we didn't do that, right? And so these things have utility. So what's the utility of being tight? Because there's a cost. It's a cost-benefit thing. It's not that one is better than the others. They're good at some things and bad at other things. And the utility of having a high consensus and a high intensity of what is the right behavior comes in really, really handy when you have a big earthquake. Right? When the earth shakes and people can't get home, and so what is the right behavior in that moment? And if you compare what happened in 2011 here to what happened in the United States with Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans has still not and the United States is very loose around that. We don't practice what to do when there's an earthquake or a dam breaks or something, right? There's some implications from this. So one is that is the innovation system. Right? And some of you have asked me about innovation, so let me just go there for a moment. The United States is a loose space, and within the United States, California, of course, is particularly loose. Really good at, anything goes, let's try a new thing. So the innovation in Silicon Valley is great. It comes with its problems, and then, not everything in Silicon Valley is nice, but it's a break it, fix it, go fast, minimum viable product, let's push that thing out and let's see what happens later. Let's break the law and have some self-driving cars drive around, Silicon Valley, who cares? If Elon Musk were Japanese, he would be in jail. Right? So tight is a very different innovation system where it's actually better at deep tech. It takes much longer, it needs a runway of 10 years, everything is slow. Sometimes there's another whole question about when is slow too slow, right? And that's definitely a problem. But so this explains sort of the stickiness that you were asking about, Rick. So why are we 20 years after they announced that cross-shareholding should be over, we still have cross-shareholdings. It's very interesting. It's been a government program for 20 years. And it's coming back. It actually came back a while ago, under the radar. And I actually been looking at that a little bit. It's coming back in a more strategic way. So in the old system of cross-shareholdings, there was a lot of pressure. If you were a supplier to another company, and you had these trade relations, you would have to actually buy their shares a little bit, right? So it was cementing the long-term relations. I think the new cross-shareholdings that we're seeing are much more strategic. They're almost like a strategic alliance or a joint venture of sorts. Right? But yeah, the stickiness is amazing, right? And I think this explains part of it, that you don't flip-flop, because we have a consensus, and we have some intensity around that consensus of what a good system is, and so we don't flip-flop on that thing. And in the United States, well, let's try something new. Oh, it didn't work. Okay, well, let's try something new, and so you get sort of whiplashed more. I don't know whether that answers your question, but.
Oh, okay, one more.
The final question, it better be good. Yeah. As long as there's no
Thank you,
pressure.
Ulrike-san. Thank you, Ulrike-san. Matsumoto from Siemens Japan. We are providing DX solution for the manufacturing companies, design softwares, manufacturing software, and we are now enjoying the growth of the DX thanks to this DX trend in Japan. But my question is, thank you. I could understand scientifically and theoretically why this trend is now coming in Japan. And I also understood US, yes, now seeking the GDP growth volume, and they are scary about the DX. Japan is positive for the DX now, but then question is, I'm curious, how about the comparison with the UK or Germany? What's happening UK, Germany about this situation, trends, economy transformation, industrial transformation? So I could understand US, Japan comparison, but from your view, Germany, UK,
Yeah.
what's happening in comparison to Japan?
So, I mean, in many aspects, that's a great question. I'm not sure I know a lot about the UK. I think the UK is lost. It's finding itself. It'll be back. London will be back. No worries. And so, in many aspects, when I think about Japan and the United States, whether, there's also financial markets, or you could think about private equity activities, or, even cross-shareholding. So, a lot of the things that we've talked about, if you think of that as a spectrum, then in many cases, so kind of for me, it's helpful to visualize this as if Japan is at one end of the spectrum and the US is, at the other. And so from what I know about Germany, which I go regularly, I speak the language, I read the newspaper, so I've never studied Germany, but as a research project. But hey, from what little I know, I would put Germany in the middle between the two, right? So it has some of the characteristics. So as you can see here, it's tighter than the U.S. And so in the innovation and startup system, very similar to Japan, so much more similar to Japan's than anything we see in the United States. Also, there's some co-location on the bubbles in those industries, whether that's cars or electronics. So there's the story, if I were to tell it about Germany, would be not as it would be less of a contrast, right? So Germany would have some of the more slower decision making, a fear of the market for corporate control. So it's a very interesting thing happening in Germany that I think we might see in Japan soon. The number of listed, so the Hagetaka, the vultures, right, the fear of the markets have actually triggered a delisting in Germany. So Germany used to have something like 1,300 listed company, and they're down to 700. If you look at, it's a very interesting defense strategy. If you don't want activist shareholders, just go private. It's the best defense, actually. The first good defense is run a good company. The number two defense is, go private. And maybe the German companies have decided that they would rather go private than the other thing. But I think that could actually be a trend that we might see here. Sort of a similar sort of fear of the activist investor. Well, we don't want this. The Urusai, the Monoyu, Kabunushi, let's just not deal with them. So there could also be some sort of similarities there. But I'm not sure, as a social scientist studying Japan, I wouldn't get less mileage analytically out of a German-Japan comparison as then I'm getting out of a U.S.-Japan comparison. I mean, there's just a bigger contrast, right? That doesn't mean that Germany is not important, but it's just it's my market. I've got to sell it, right? I've got to sell books. Hey, on that note.
Okay. Let's see. Orders of business. First, the club presents speakers with an honorary membership card.
Oh.
And here is yours, Professor. And I have a written instruction here saying that the room must be cleared by 9 o'clock. And that leaves 25 minutes for all you shy people to come up here and talk to Professor Schaede individually, or maybe she can wander around and talk to you. She prefers to talk standing up. And thank you for coming. One bit of advertising. On December 18th, if you're more interested in writing a book than reading a book, the next book break will be called How to Publish, it says in Japan, but it means about Japan, Can Foreign Authors Succeed? So I hope to see you here on the 18th of December. And now I think the bar is still open, and Professor Schaede will be happy to talk to you individually. Thank you very much.
Thanks, sir.